Let's try it again. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Natalie. I'll be your MC. And before we get started, I wanted to give a special thanks to our host, Hotel RL, for providing this beautiful venue space. And I wanted to invite Chris, the manager, to explain a little bit more to you about living stages.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming down. Welcome to the brand new Hotel RL Brooklyn. We just opened in February, brand new to the area. And if I invite you to check out our website. This is our beautiful living stage area. We host all different kinds of events here. This stage portion actually can be utilized complimentary if you know anyone in the entertainment business or even for things like this, seminars. They can come in. We host like a community-based meeting, and it just gets everyone in the area involved, and it's just a great setting to have that. So I welcome you to the seminar here, and enjoy yourself, and thank you for coming down.
Thanks again to Hotel RL, and welcome to Brooklyn. I want to give another special thanks to our meetup organizers. So that is Noreen Weisel, who couldn't be here today. Chris, of course, for providing the space. And Loriano, who's going to introduce our guest speaker for today, Michael.
Our guest speaker for today, Michael Shapiro. I am... Is this working? Yeah. I'm giving this introduction on behalf of Gary Richmond, who couldn't make it today. So this is his introduction as read by me to you about Michael. So it's an honor and a privilege to introduce Michael Shapiro, who will speak on the semiotics of multilingualism. Michael is unquestionably one of the preeminent living linguists and perhaps the only prominent linguist in the world whose work is deeply informed by the American scientist, logician, semiotician, and philosopher Charles S. Peirce, the originator of the only homegrown school of philosophy, namely American pragmatism. Michael speaks of having heard him speak on many occasions, including at the Peirce Centennial at UMass in Lowell in 2014, and guarantees that any lecture or speech delivered by Michael will be of interest to pretty much anyone interested in these topics. He also mentions that Michael Shapiro speaks often around the world, has lectured in over 100 times in the US, Europe, and South America. He is the past president of the Peirce Society as well as the Semiotic Society of America. A prolific author, having authored or co-authored with his late wife, Marianne, over 11 books. One book in particular that Gary wanted to mention is The Speaking Self, Language, Lore, and the English Usage. And there's a description of that on a piece of paper that you can get at that table over there. Gary says, a delightful book which I often pick up, always finding something new and fascinating about English and occasionally Russian usage. One could say the same about his blog. Michael also has a blog. I might add on a personal note that Michael is the founder and current president of the New Metaphysical Club, a small group of New York City Persians, including Gary himself, who meet once a month for lunch and philosophical discussion. Michael, who is Professor Emeritus of Slavic and Semiotic Studies at Brown and Adjunct Professor in the Society of Senior Scholars at Columbia, was born in Yokohama, spent World War II in Japan, and grew up speaking Russian, Japanese, and English. He has earned degrees in Slavic languages and literatures at UCLA and Harvard, and received his PhD from Harvard. Besides Brown and Columbia, he has taught at UCLA, Princeton, UC Berkeley, and Green Mountain College. I am delighted to give you Michael Shapiro.
Is it better here in my vest pocket, do you think? Yeah. I'm going to pass out a handout. I believe in being old-fashioned. I believe in paper handouts rather than PowerPoints or overheads. Thank you very much. And I'm not reading a paper, which I think is idiotic because it can be put on the web. What's the point of reading a paper, although people still do it? But if you've been teaching for over 50 years, the way I have, it seems to me if you know your subject, you don't need a piece of paper or to be reading a text. You can hear me, right? I think I'm loud enough. The only advantage of this flyer is you get 20% off the price of the book, which they did an actually nice job on. It looks like this. The only trouble with these books is they're expensive, so if you go on Amazon, you can get it for 30% off or something. This is a usage manual in an age when usage manuals are very much in vogue. And, but it's sui generis. There's no such book. And James Fernandez, who's a very prominent anthropologist, said such nice things about it, including that he knew of no other such book. I thought it would be nice to have a blurb from him. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but he teaches at the University of Chicago, or did. Well, there's a multilingualism is something which is in the news now because of migration, because of people going all over the world with their own languages and settling in places where their language, they have to learn the language of the country. And I want to start by, I'll refer to the handout, but you read English, so I don't have to read the handout. But you can, I will tell you where I am on the handout. What do I do? Okay. Well, this is just the power, right? Yeah. How's that? Better? La la la. Why not? My voice isn't bad, actually. I'm a musician, so I wanted to start by giving you a little aperçu, which is apropos of the topic. See, I used two French words, aperçu and apropos. Why did I do that? Well, because I happen to know French, and those words are more apt than any. I could have said outline, and it comes in handy to have words which have some power in English to give you a concise idea of what the speaker has in mind. But let me back up a little bit and introduce the subject by telling you how I came to this idea. I mean, I've published on all kinds of topics, including I discovered a bird cult in old Europe. Can you believe? The cult of the pelican. Yes, there was a cult. People worshipped the pelican. And if you're aware of the pelican of piety, do you know that figure in Catholic theology? The pelican pierces its breast, and it's a Christological symbol because the blood that comes out of the breast is the blood of Christ on the cross. So I've done all kinds of research, really, when I look back on my own life, I say to myself, you know, who the hell is that? I look in the mirror, I don't recognize myself. I mean, a pelican cult. But my family was full of people like that. And I'll give you another example. When I get more into the topic, I grew up in a family consisting of 8 people, 5 boys, father and mother, and then we had a governess, a woman who was stone deaf. She had lost her hearing at the age of 3, but luckily her mother was a speech therapist. So she grew up reading lips, and she had no family of her own. And my mother engaged her as a nurse when she gave birth to her first two children, twins, in Tel Aviv. My parents passed through Palestine in the 20s on the way to Japan. And my mother had pneumonia when she gave birth and needed some help. So she happened to know somebody whose sister was looking for work, and that sister became my second mother. Her name was Rebecca Weissman, and she's in the handout. You can read about her. And she spoke only Russian. I mean, she had a smattering of Japanese and Chinese and English, but just enough to go to the supermarket and say, I want those bananas. Yes, we have some bananas. But she and I spent a tremendous amount of time together. She also wrote poetry, and of course she only spoke Russian. And Russian is my mother tongue. I learned Japanese. I was born in Yokohama, as was mentioned. Japanese is my second native language. I learned it before English because I didn't go to school until the American occupation came in after the war. And then my mother, who was a concert pianist, but taught piano at the military school because the American occupation established a whole school system for the children of the soldiers and sailors. And so she was able to enroll me in that school, even though it was only for military personnel. But since she was a teacher there, they made an exception, and they forced us to pay tuition. But anyway, that's how I learned English. So until the age of 6, I didn't speak English. I spoke Japanese, and I still do, because I went back to Japan as a postdoctoral student and learned how to read and write. And now I speak Japanese fluently, and there's no accent. I don't have an accent in Japanese. And in the old days, when I would speak up as an adult, the Japanese would gawk at me. They couldn't believe that those words were coming out of my mouth because they have this idea. The Japanese are particularistic. That's the sociological term. That their culture is unique. There's nothing else like it. So they don't expect anybody. This was the old days. Now there are so many Australians and Americans and Englishmen speaking Japanese. It doesn't faze. A young Japanese isn't fazed by it. But in the old days, like in the 60s, if I took a taxi and then spoke to the driver in Japanese, his mouth would literally fall open. They didn't expect it. In fact, I'll tell you an anecdote which shows you the strangeness of linguistic usage. It's all apropos. It bears on the fact of several languages being spoken at the same time by one individual or in a community, because that's the semiotics part I'll explain in a minute. Because there's always the semiotics of this, the semiotics of that. It's meaningless. It can be used in a totally meaningless way. And I want to use it in a specific way. That's the sign action and sign interpretation. And it's not French, it's not Saussurian, it's not post-structuralism. There's no such thing as post-structuralism. It's a mistake perpetrated by the French. But anyway, they perpetrate a lot of hoaxes. My brother had a real experience. My brother, who will be prominent in my discussion today, my brother Jacob, who lives in Japan, married a Japanese, one graduate of a Japanese university, lived there for many years, is multilingual. He told me a story after the war. He was driving around not far from Tokyo. He lost his way. And he stopped. There was a farmer tilling the soil, and he stopped the car, walked out, and said to the farmer in perfect Japanese, "Can you tell me the way to such and such a place?" And you know what the farmer said to him in Japanese, because he only spoke that? "I'm sorry, I don't speak English." Now, it's funny, isn't it? But he didn't mean it as a joke. And this phenomenon is a known thing, that people from all over the world who are completely insulated from other languages, sometimes, even if they understand what you're saying, but there's a psychological barrier to the point that they don't understand what you're saying. They don't believe that you're talking their language to them because you don't fit the description of a native speaker of that language. So this is sounds like a joke, but it's not. It's a known psychological phenomenon. Does everybody have a handout? These flyers you can get from that table later if you're interested. Now, several languages cohabiting, if we can say that, in a human brain are usually the accident of birth in a particular milieu where these languages are spoken, including the family. And of course, the family is the immediate matrix in which these things occur. But there are other meanings of multilingualism. For instance, private language, which I'll mention, and you'll see in my handout. There are private languages, including things like thieves argot. Have you heard that phrase, thieves argot? You know the word argot, A-R-G-O-T, which is a French word. Argot or argot is a kind of version of language which is spoken by a small group, and thieves all over the world have developed languages which are private. That's another phrase. In addition to the language that they would speak to ordinary people, they have an argot that they've developed to hide the meaning of what they're saying from the police mainly, but from other people who are not thieves. Have you run into this notion, any of you? Yeah. It's been studied. You know, there are descriptions of argot like that. There are also, and this has not been studied as much as I will show you it can be studied in my talk tonight, and that is what I call a family argot. There is a family argot, which is a kind of private language. And let's skip to that right away by going to page 3 on your handout B, part B. This is, I'm using examples from my family because they're close to my heart and to my mind, both. And my wife, Marianne Shapiro, of blessed memory, was born in Budapest, came to America at the age of 3, and she retained her Hungarian, her native Hungarian, all her life, even though she had no occasion to use it. She became the most accomplished and most versatile American Italianist of the 20th century. She was a musician. She learned Italian through her love of music, accompanying people at the High School of Music and Art in Manhattan, singers who sang in Italian. So she said when she was a child, she wanted to learn. She had a French tutor, and she spoke French fluently as a child. Her parents came from that old school of wealthy people who, remember when girls went to finishing school? Does anybody? Yeah, do you remember? No, I don't remember. But there is such a thing, right? And learning French was important. You learn how to dance, you learn French, and you learn piano. And my wife's mother, my mother-in-law, believed in that. She came from a wealthy Hungarian family in Budapest, and she thought her daughter should learn French and piano. The only trouble was that her daughter learned these things better than the mother. And so the one thing that she was able to do was to cook. She thought she could cook better than her daughter, and she would not allow my wife to step in the kitchen because she wanted one thing that she could do that her daughter couldn't do. And she never gave her any recipes, imagine. That's the kind of woman she was. Very formidable, and she was 102 when she died, of course. That kind of person lives a long life. But here in B on page 3, well, you can imagine what a daughter, my daughter is now 48, but you can imagine a child growing up with two parents who have several languages, who are professors of Italian and Russian, who invent words and so on. Here's a private language in the family context where you can say things to each other, not because you want to hide it from other people, like a thief would want to hide what they're saying from the police or other people, but this was a way of bonding with each other. It's a matter of solidarity. And this is something that I'm going to emphasize, that language use, among other goals, has solidarity in mind. It's a way of demonstrating your solidarity with other people. But before I do that, I want to give you this example. And I try to explain these things. You can read, if Abigail says Mumar, which is one of the pet names for her mother, instead of saying Mom, she would say Mumar. So she got into it. My daughter Abigail is a very talented woman who has 2 children. I can't look at her and say woman, because to me she looks 12. But, but there she has 2 children, so she looks very young. But you'll see that there are these words that come in which are based on English grammar. That's the thing. That's always parasitic on the language of the people speaking, the regular, ordinary language, just like Pig Latin is parasitic on Latin, right? Anybody speak Pig Latin here? No. Is it the children learn that anymore or not? Okay. But you can see that it's always I say parasitic. I don't mean it. I mean this technically, not pejoratively. That it's based on something, just like Esperanto is basically a Romance language, It's based on Romance grammar and Romance lexicon and so on. So this is a private, recreated out of my memory of how we spoke. I think of my wife every day. We fell in love immediately and we only saw each other 9 times before we got married. There is such a thing as love at first sight. And it runs in families, because my parents also fell in love and got married immediately. Can you imagine doing that now? Most people would say you're out of your mind. How can you marry somebody that you've only seen 9 times? Well, voila. Now, so the private languages are one thing that widen, that expand the scope of multilingualism. Do you agree? That you are multilingual in some diminished sense of the word, but nevertheless it's multilingual, it's polyglossia, it's many ways of speaking. That there are also, if you come down to a micro level rather than a whole language, there are words that are peculiar to you, that you use them because they have an emotive connotation, that they have an emotional charge that they don't have for other people. They're not words that are invented to be used privately, but they have a particular connotation. So we'll do that. I'm just running through some variations of the idea of multilingualism. People have penchants. They have peculiarities. Notice I didn't say penchant. I said penchant. I believe in anchitization. I'm a purist. You'll see if you read my book, I make it very clear that I'm a purist and I have a prescriptivist bias. The people like my brother Jacob, who figures prominently in the handout, some people have predilections for certain forms of expression. For instance, his predilection, aside from saying the word incidentally every time he speaks, and I keep saying, why are you saying incidentally? By the way, and incidentally, every discourse is introduced in his speech by those 2 words. By the way, as a phrase, and incidentally. He ignores me. He's 11 years my senior, and he doesn't care what I think, even though, we're not children anymore. But we talk by Skype. He lives in L.A. So every day the Skype goes on, and we're talking, just the way we were when I was a little boy, and he was my closest brother. He took me under his wing, and we remained the two closest of the five. We were the ones that maintained this closeness. He loves Japanese proverbs. Apropos, number 2 on page 2, Roman numeral 2. Here's a discourse specimen recreated from memory of a conversation between us on January 25th, 2010. He was at home. I was laying over at the Cleveland airport, flying back to LA. Now, what you have here is technically called macaronic. Have you ever heard that phrase? No. Okay. Macaronic speech or verse, especially with the verse, is when you mix several languages in one discourse. Macaronic verse, you can see why macaroni, whoever coined this phrase or this word macaronic, things that are mixed up. Macaroni gives you that image of things being mixed up. Well, the way it lies on a plate, or in a bowl. So here you have Japanese, English, and Russian, the three languages that we both speak, being macaronically said. And I start out by using a Japanese. Phatic means establishing communication, like emphatic, phatic, Greek word to mean contact. You open your dialogue with a Japanese phrase. Have you ever heard this, moshi moshi? Anybody with a military background, parents who were in the military, who served in World War II, no? Mushi, they say mushi mushi. They got it wrong. It's moshi moshi. Moshi means if. It's the word if in Japanese, and the combination is the standard opening phrase for a Japanese conversation over the phone. You have to do it. You cannot speak Japanese over the phone without saying moshi moshi to open. When you call up and say, when we say hello or hi, they say moshi moshi. So something like hello there. And from there on, they usually, it takes the same kind of talk, and you can see two brothers who have talked to each other for decades and who have a certain repertoire that they go over. And Jacob has this faiblesse of questioning his knowledge of Russian. He's embarrassed by the fact that until he was 8 years old, he only spoke Russian. So why doesn't he speak it well now? Well, because he ended up living in Japan, going to Japanese schools, marrying a Japanese woman to whom he's still married. He didn't, no, he was not a serial, what's the word? He didn't marry many women, because in Japan it was easy to shed, as they say. I grew up in Hollywood, so someone was always shedding somebody, A man was shedding his wife. They still use that, don't they? Right? It's always a man that's shedding his wife. And with all these actors who got married 9 times, a beautiful woman like Elizabeth Taylor, why did she have to marry 7 times? Of course, the husband that she really loved died in an airplane crash. So, poor woman, beautiful woman, who lived in, grew up in Hollywood. And so Jacob is peculiarly hung up on this notion that he ought to know Russian better. He speaks Russian without an accent, but he has trouble with grammar. He sometimes doesn't know how to say something in Russian, and he's embarrassed by it. And so since I'm a professor of Russian, he'll always ask, he'll say, is it correct? Did I say it right? You know, like at the bottom of page 2. And he's so proud when he can come out with the right phrase in Russian. But he also has this strange addiction to proverbs. Japanese has 100,000 proverbs. Can you believe that? Can you believe that one language has 100? There's a proverb dictionary that's this thick. The reason Japanese has so many proverbs is that it borrowed a lot of Chinese proverbs. So you can have Japanese proverbs and then the Chinese proverbs, which came in with the characters, with the writing system from Japan. So you can say, in fact, sometimes you can say the same proverb in the Japanese, with Japanese words, and then make it into a Chinese proverb by just putting Chinese vocables, syllables, which have the same meaning. Here are some of his now this pertains to multilingualism subcutaneously. Here is a person who speaks several languages habitually. He speaks Japanese to his wife of many years standing. He has 3 beautiful daughters. You know how Eurasian daughters are, I mean women, are sometimes strikingly, stunningly beautiful. No, you don't know this? Maybe you don't go to Vietnam or to, I don't know. Anyway, these 3 girls who are in there, I call them girls, they're women of course, but I've known them since they're toddlers. They're in their 30s, they're beautiful women, all unmarried, I don't know what's going on. They have boyfriends, but they don't want to get married because living in Los Angeles, they can't marry a man who can support them with children. You know, they don't make enough money, so what's the point? Anyway, this is a family in which the 2 parents speak Japanese to each other habitually. They don't speak English, and my sister-in-law only speaks Japanese. Her English is terrible, even though she's lived in LA for many years. Husband and wife only speak Japanese. Daughters are bilingual. They can speak Japanese fluently and English. They've gone to both kinds of schools. They speak English to each other. They speak Japanese to the mother and English to the father. If they're sitting at a table for a meal, the 5 of them, husband and wife, mother and father, speak Japanese. Father speaks English to the daughters. Daughters speak English back to the father. They speak Japanese to the mother. Mother speaks Japanese to her husband and Japanese to her daughters. Here is a real life living situation of multilingualism. Now, what can you make of that? Well, you can make several things. You can derive several things. And before I tell you what I derived from it, I want to go back to the title of my talk, which was suggested actually by Bev Corwin, The Semiotics of Multilingualism. Now, I use semiotics in a very specific way because I'm an adherent of the sign theory of Charles Sanders Peirce. You know, I've spent my entire scholarly life trying to use his philosophy, as was mentioned in the introduction, and without embarrassment, I can say that I am by far the most prominent linguist who has used American pragmatism to make sense of linguistic structure. And for Peirce, who is the founder of modern sign theory, not Saussure and nobody else, Peirce is the founder of sign theory. A sign is something that is capable of signifying. That's the definition of a sign, of signifying. Now, of course, it has to signify to somebody. although Peirce went so far as to say that a heliotrope, when it turns towards the sun, is engaged in semiotic behavior. And that may not convince you. He said that the heliotrope, in turning towards the sun, is reacting to the sun in a semiotic way, that this is a sign of the sun's rays as interpreted by the heliotrope. You know, this is phytosemiosis. Phyto, P-H-Y-T-O, do you know Greek? It's not phyto, F-I-D-O. Phytosemiosis would be what dogs do, right, phyto. But this is phytosemiosis. I don't go that far. I tell my students, yes, Peirce thought that even a riverbed that takes on a certain shape is undergoing a semiotic condition because it's the shape of the river that it makes in the riverbed. So there is a semiotic relationship between the flow of the river and the indentations in the riverbed. Okay, but the important thing is that it has to signify, and language is the primary semiotic system. There is no other system that has the same power. We live in a world in which human beings have the greatest power of signifying, of using signs to indicate a meaning. Now, so the semiotics, in my sense, is the use of signs to signify such that the signs will be interpreted by anyone who has an inclination to do it. You can ignore some sign. It says signs across the street. And next door it says pay-o-matic, money centers. Well, I can read English and I can ignore it. I can go by. I'm not interested in check cashing or whatever other bogus thing they're doing there. So there has to be an interpreter. So it's two-sided to begin with. But this is where Saussure and the French went wrong. Semiosis is not binary, it's ternary. There always is something which means something to someone else. So it has to be interpreted. And then the meaning has to be held in common. Because if I go around saying things that no one understands, I will probably be arrested and sent to a mental institution. Although in Manhattan it used to be the case. You know, when I started living in New York, there were plenty of people on the street talking into the air, and they were not arrested. They were, you know, they were poor people who needed treatment, but they were just talking into the air. Sometimes they used English, sometimes it was gibberish. Where does the meaning come in? This is important, I think, because there's a lot of there are a lot of misconceptions about meaning, including in the present way in which the present philosophical take on meaning. And I want to convince you that meaning is not created ab novo. It's already there. It pre-exists us as human beings. The meaning is already there. And this is what's meant by the semiotic web, since we're involved in the semiotic web mashup meetup, right? The semiotic web, that idea of the web, is that there is meaning already out there. And we as human beings are plunged into this meaning, and in order to make ourselves understood, because we have this capacity as a human species to use language to make ourselves understood to other people, the meaning is out there, and we carve out parts of that meaning in order to make ourselves understood to other people. So that the meaning is not created by us, it already is there. Now you can say, well, did Chagall, or I don't know, take a modernist painter. Well, they created something which existed them. It's just that they carved out a space that nobody else had carved out before. So they creativity in this sense is finding spots in the web, in the semiotic web, that you can narrow down and then present physically, because it has to be transmissible. If I never say a word to you and just look at you, you may read my expressions, the paralinguistic part, for instance, my smiles, or if I, and Americans now, I notice, and since I live alone now, I'm in the habit of watching other people a lot more than I used to. And the gesticulations and the twist of the mouth, and this is all what's called paralinguistic. It's accompanying speech. You know, I don't see people sitting in a restaurant who go like this. No, they're talking to somebody else, and they're going like that and saying, have you noticed how people do it, especially women? Women do this much more than men, although men are catching up. And it adds to the meaning. But the meaning, you could say, well, if the meaning pre-exists the gesticulations, yeah, there's a meaning field which a gesticulation that you have adopted will tend to make more palpable. And then the interpretation has to come in. Whether you like it or not, you're confronted with a physical manifestation of something which is meaningful. On the other hand, it could be a habit which has no meaning at all. You know, if I have a habit of picking my nose, I'm just, that's just rude behavior, and your parents should have taught you not to do it. On the other hand, maybe you have some kind of illness which causes you to do it in public. And you have to tell little children not to do it. So the whole idea of semiosis, that's the technical word, that is the meaning, that's from Peirce. Peirce's idea was the semiosis is what we are embedded in, and we make meaning because we have the tools which we share with each other, and language being the most prominent one. If I go around talking to myself or only using words that nobody else understands, if I have a private language, which I've created, and there is such a syndrome, you know. Have you ever met people like that? Anybody have a mental health background here? Okay, but that's a known syndrome that psychiatrists and psychologists have to deal with. People who create a language of their own and only speak that. They create it from scratch, and they cannot communicate in any. Usually, as I said, parasitic on some other language. But there are children who have this disease because it's a brain problem. You know, it's neuro. So when we communicate multilingually, since that's our topic, what is it that happens? The Russian material is only for those who read Russian. That's page 4. I thought if you know Russian, you'll be able to appreciate this, and there's no point in translating it, because it's characteristic of a certain kind of mentality that I wanted to introduce. My parents are the ones in the appendices here, and you'll see what's going on. Now, when people have several languages under their belt, they have to be able to use them judiciously. Sometimes it's only a practical thing that you use a certain language in a certain situation because, let's say you're a merchant who travels, and this was true, for instance, of Eastern European Jews who spoke Yiddish in their own milieu, but then when they went to sell cloth in Czechoslovakia or Bohemia or someplace, and they had to deal with Czech or Slovak cloth merchants, they had to learn the language of that milieu. They also spoke Slovak. Like my father-in-law was born in Košice, which, does that town mean anything? It's a very large town, which is now in Slovakia, but it was a border town between Hungary and Slovakia. So he learned Hungarian. He had to learn Slovak because he was a lumber merchant. So he went into the Slovak community and dealt with people who he bought trees from. He also spoke German because there were plenty of German speakers in that area. And so that you can apportion how you speak a certain language depending on the milieu. And it may be simply practical because you have to be able to use the language of the person that you're interacting with for commercial purposes. Whereas in the family, you will only speak, and of course, the Jews of the shtetl spoke Yiddish. That was their native language, but they also had to learn German. Yiddish is a Germanic, quasi-Germanic language with Hebrew and Slavic admixtures. It's interesting that it was looked down on among Russian Jews of a certain class. Not to speak Yiddish was a badge of honor because they looked down on Jews from the shtetl. My parents came from very wealthy families who had gone to university, and so on, and they learned English, German, and French at home because my grandparents imported governesses. That was the habit, the practice among wealthy people in Russia, that they imported tutors from abroad. And as you know, the Russian Tsarist imperial family spoke French well into the 20th century. But 19th century, if you read Tolstoy or any book in which aristocrats speak, they often speak in French to each other because that was the language at court. They didn't speak Russian, they spoke French. Of course, this began in the 17th and 18th century. It's not that they didn't speak Russian, they did speak Russian, but they may have spoken French better than Russian. Some prince so-and-so, Trubetskoy maybe spoke French better than Russian. In my parents' family, they imported governesses. There were women who came and lived with them for a year or two, and the children had to learn the language of the governess. They learned French and German as children, which served them in good stead because when they became refugees after the revolution, 1919, my father left Russia and started traveling all over the world until they ended up in Japan. French and German came in very handy. They went to Germany, they went to France. When they moved to Japan, they had to use English very often among refugees who didn't speak Japanese. My parents actually learned Japanese. My father even wrote books in Japanese. But he was a special case. He was an amazing man, amazing to the point of really amazing somebody. When you met him, he could speak your language, no matter who you were. He also, when they were in Palestine, they picked up Hebrew, learned how to read. He could read the Bible in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, which he did regularly. And he was a believer, but he never went to the synagogue. He didn't believe in the ritual. He only believed. He told me, I'll never forget this, and which I've carried with me the rest of my life. He said, the only good thing, the important thing about religion is, and he used the Hebrew phrase, lev tov. Does anybody know Hebrew? Lev tov, do you know what that means? Yes, a good heart. I never forgot that. He said the important thing is to have a good heart. Now, what rabbi would say that to a congregation? He'd be out of a job. You have to do this and that. I saw a couple, a Hasidic couple on the subway today. I said to myself, I don't see them that often in my neighborhood, even though Chabad has a Chabad house where I live in Manhattan. The guy had a hat on like this with things sticking out of it. I don't know what the hell they were. And of course, his wife had a shawl on. And they were young people. They couldn't have been more than 25. There they are. They're probably living in some Hasidic community, speaking Yiddish to each other. They speak English. In these 17th and 18th century Polish costumes. You know that? These Hasidic get-ups come from Poland. Okay. But anyway, a good heart. What can you do with a good heart? You can be a good person, but you can't have a religion because they'll say, well, I want to, be told to do this and be told to do that, and whether you cross yourself this way using 3 fingers or 2. That was the dispute between the Russian Orthodox, the two. Do you know the Old Believers? Have you heard of the Old Believers in the Russian Orthodox Church? It's a sect which split off from the main body of Russian Orthodoxy over things like how many fingers you use to cross yourself. And they were exiled. The ones who refused to cross themselves with 2 fingers, because they believed in the Trinity, they had to go live in Canada and Mexico. You don't know about that? No. Anyway, a good heart. You heard it here. That's my religion. I finally formulated my religion. Most important thing is making other people happy. And if you love them, all the more. Make the person that you love happy. And everything else will be. That's, to me, a religious mentality. But you can see that growing up in a secular family, my parents didn't, I wasn't even bar mitzvah. They didn't go to the synagogue. My mother sometimes on high holidays would go, but my father never set foot. And they were married in a civil ceremony in Berlin and so on. But they were good people. They were nice people. They gave food to the homeless, Okay, that's not multilingual. I don't know, but it may, for all I know, and there may be some research, there's an article that Gary Richmond sent me about how the world view of people differs depending on how many languages they know. And so the idea, and there is a hypothesis which I think is borne out by empirical research, that the more languages you know, the more takes on reality you have. And that knowing a particular language puts a stamp on how you carve the meaning out of this semiotic web. That how you get, the semiosis is there. You come to it as a sentient, absent pathologies. You're a sentient human being who can learn how to communicate with other human beings. And then you carve out the same kind of meaning from the reality that you confront because you want to be able to communicate with other members of your community. Because you wouldn't survive. Why do children learn the language of their parents? If they didn't learn the language of well, first of all, you can say that this is just a practical case of imitating what's around you. You don't learn Japanese if you don't hear it as a child. And so if you're born into a family where Russian is the language that's spoken at home, then as a child you slowly acquire that language and you use it to communicate because you wouldn't survive. You wouldn't be able to ask for food when you need it, or if you have to go to the toilet. Mama, I want to go. Okay. If you did it in Esperanto and nobody understood it, you wouldn't get on very well. So that kind of evolutionary ambience in which the thing is goal-oriented is typical of the survival of linguistic communities, that they speak these languages and they speak other languages along with what they learn at home from their parents in order to get along with communities that border them, like commercial communities and so on. When they go into personal or idiosyncratic variations of their own language, that may be a sign of their personality. Like my brother has this, he is a totally Japanized Russian Jew. Japanization is, I'm using it clinically. What does that mean? Have you ever heard the word Japanize, the verb? Well, Bev has, and Hannah, where is she? She disappeared. She may know that word. That means your mentality is you think like a Japanese. You act like a Japanese. your value system becomes Japanese. Here is this specimen who's going to be 89 in August, who thinks like a Japanese. He speaks perfect English. His Russian is basically grammatically correct, and his vocabulary, he never went to Russian school and so on, so it's a little bit weak, and he'll ask me, how do you say this? Is this correct in Russian? It's not. Okay, but and I noticed that his Japanese is better than his English. He's a graduate of a British high school in Japan. He went to a British school. He graduated from a Japanese university. He reads and writes Japanese, but his Japanese now is better, maybe because he talks to his wife all the time. She's 21 years younger. Luckily, she can take care of him. Poor guy, his vision is a little, he has macular degeneration, which is a terrible thing. He's losing his sight, can't drive anymore. But he still has that same mentality. So this kind of mentality of using a language which is not really your native language, but you have it down perfectly because it expresses your personality, it affirms your value system, and it shapes your personality. I'll give you a case. Of course, you can say that this is quasi-pathological. Since he has this predilection for sprinkling his Japanese with proverbs, I have been a witness to the fact where he goes to a park. I lived in Japan and I went there. My daughter and my son-in-law were living there, so I would go there when he was there. He would go and park his car in a Japanese parking lot in Tokyo, and then before giving the keys to the parking lot attendant, he would say something in Japanese to them, but include a proverb that the Japanese had never heard. And why did he do that? He knew that that proverb would not be understood by that young man, because it's a form of superiority complex, that he could lord it over this poor Japanese guy who was just a parking lot attendant, probably not a college graduate, but he would open his mouth because he'd never heard the proverb, which was apropos. The proverb fit, but he'd never heard it, and my brother knew that he'd never heard it. Okay, so this is a strange personality. Incidentally, incidentally, I said incidentally. My brother is the kindest, most generous person, almost that I know, almost. He dotes on his children. He would give you the shirt off his back. He would do if you're in distress, he'll do anything for you. Money doesn't mean anything. So here's a strange person who speaks these languages and has this linguistic quirk of trying to show that he is holier than thou when it comes to a Japanese. He wants to affirm his Japanese identity even though his face doesn't fit. Like that farmer who said, I don't speak English. Now, the use of, let's go to page, I don't know if you can make some kind of psychological argument out of his favorite proverbs. They have to do, I noticed, since I'm empirically oriented, I used him as a kind of subject that I study. He likes to use proverbs that involve animals, like dung beetles, monkeys. Have you ever heard of even the dung beetle loves its own bailiwick? That's the English translation. Do you understand what that means? Well, I don't know if you've ever seen it. Maybe you haven't lived in that kind of milieu. You know, I've lived in the country where there's dung that animals leave, and then beetles come and they eat some of the things in the dung, and they inhabit that. Like, what else does that? Beetles, faggots, ants maybe? I don't know. Insects of various kinds will go into that, the leavings, you know, the offal. And he loves that expression, sechin mushi mo tokorobiki, that even a dung beetle loves its own bailiwick. That means that even someone who is very humble, has nothing to recommend them, is very of no consequence, loves their own milieu. Or even the monkey falls from a tree. So someone who's capable, you know, is adept at doing, will sometimes have situations in which they come a cropper. How often have you heard that? You know that phrase, to come a cropper? It means to, no? Yeah. It's to fall. When this goes on YouTube, he's going to see this. But we love each other, so you'll forgive me. Okay, now here on page 5 at the bottom. Oh, well, let's go to the Arthur Conan Doyle, who's one of my favorite authors. And you know, Sherlock Holmes is a semiotician. Did you know that? And there have been books written about Thomas Sebeok, who was an American semiotician, professor of anthropology at Indiana. He wrote a book about the Conan Doyle stories, or Conan, some say Conan, some Conan, I guess, which analyze the stories from the point of view of semiotics. That signs, you know, Sherlock Holmes goes around noticing certain things about the crime scene or about people, and from this he divines who they are, where they came from, and maybe they're the criminal, the perpetrator of the crime. But the author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was a very prolific writer, who wrote adventure novels, not just Sherlock Holmes novels. You know that he wrote a great deal of long novels that had nothing to do with Sherlock Holmes. I don't know if people don't read that anymore. He was also a spiritualist. He believed in seances and all that. He was a very interesting man. And he was a doctor. He was a medical doctor. Here is an example, a couple of examples that I've read these stories over and over again my whole life. I'm so attracted to them. And he was, I think, a wonderful writer. But here, I won't go into all of them, but what does it mean for a person to use an expression from a language other than the expression of the discourse? That's something to ponder. What does it mean? Well, it could be practical. You know, I'm just suggesting it. I'm not saying that I know what the answer is. I use words not to flash my badge as a speaker of French, because my French is not very good. I can speak French, you know, with a good accent, but it's not fluent. My German is much better than my French. I just sometimes find that a French word is the one that comes to mind in a certain English context. And of course, I know a professor of French at UCLA who's a Jew from the Bronx. He teaches French at UCLA and has been there for many years. And he constantly uses French in his English. Obviously, that's kind of flashing a badge, right? And saying, I'm a professor of French, and I'm going to use French words because it makes me feel good. This is what I do. It somehow props up my identity. But here, in a highfalutin English context, you know, because this is fine, this is good prose, but it's speech. It's people speaking to each other in a prose work. So it's direct discourse. I mean, like number 2. He can find something, remarked Holmes, shrugging his shoulders. He has occasional glimmerings of reason. And then il n'y a pas de sot si un commode qui se corrompt, and so on. Which he got wrong, because I looked it up. See, that's where the linguist comes in. When I saw this, I went, because my edition said it's from Rochefoucauld, so I went to Rochefoucauld, and I looked it up, and this Maxime number 451 says not what, it says, il n'y a pas de sot si incommode qui ceux qui ont d'esprit. And he said, where did he make the mistake? The C, he left out. No, il n'y a pas de sot, il n'y a point de sot. The correct version is il n'y a pas de sot. I know. Now, what can you say? Obviously, Conan Doyle remembered this, right? He didn't go to Rochefoucauld and look up the original. He wanted to use a French proverb or expression, and he thought that it was appropriate. Am I running over? Okay. Anyway, you get the drift, right? Just one more thing. Here's something from my book. 30 words they didn't teach me at PS 187. PS 187 is in Washington Heights, and my wife went to PS 187. It's on Cabrini Boulevard. She went there, and she wrote a book in which she used words like synderesis, insolubilia, and so I listed them. This is a novel I wrote about her. I wrote a novel about my wife called My Wife's a Metaphysician. And so I included there, based on Japanese writing by women writers from the Middle Ages. I copied a genre of writing from the Japanese Middle Ages. And I put in all these words which happened to appear in a book that Marianne wrote. And so you could say that this is a kind of lingo that you, almost like a technical jargon. Let's say an engineer has technical words that nobody else knows. And here is a scholar of Italian, medieval, and Renaissance literature who uses words which are appropriate to the subject, but nobody would use synderesis in speech unless you happen to know. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Yes, please give Michael a round of applause. That was excellent. Thank you, Michael.